I've been blessed with having Lakshmi Priya Daniel join me as a United Board Fellow, and she's here for 2 months and very closely observing our practices in terms of leadership. So that's what brought Priya here initially as a winner of a fellowship to study in part at Harvard and to come and observe practices at the University of Melbourne. Priya brings so much with her as well though, and she's a practicing artist and an art historian, and so we're very privileged now to be hearing Priya's talk about her particular area of interest, which is gender, how gender has shaped histories of Indian art. And I think we're in for a treat. I know that Priya is passionate about her work and has a wonderfully sort of developed sense of its place in the work of Indian artists, particularly women artists, more broadly in the place of art history. So, if you could join me in welcoming Associate Professor Lakshmi Priya Daniel.
Thank you, Kate, for that introduction. I'm truly honored to be here today. It is, of course, thanks to the United Board for Christian Higher Education and also my own college and the University of Melbourne. I have a lot of people to thank for, especially Kate here. And thank you all for coming. I hope you're in for some time when you can look at India, and one part of India really, the south of India. If you'll humor me for a few minutes, I'm going to quite literally locate myself in the context of the world. This is an illustration by an illustrator, modern illustrator. This is done sometime about 2016 or 17. And you'll notice that one of the most long-standing tropes or stereotypes which have been associated with India has been the idea of elephants. So the illustrator continues to daub an elephant on top of India. And of course, I came to Australia expecting to find kangaroos at every road, in every part of Melbourne city. I haven't seen one so far. So you know where I'm coming from when I say that this is how we think of India as well. India, the same illustrator, also speaks of India and its diversity, which is where I will be beginning my talk. And this is a little city called Chennai. It was born as Madras. I hope some of you have had a chance to use something called the Madras handkerchiefs. Sorry, I don't know why this keeps moving forward. The Madras handkerchiefs, the normal checks that you would see comes from this part of India. And this is an 1857 map. I'm very fond of maps, and as the maps indicate on the walls of the old arts building, there are lots of maps of India too. India has been reimagined again and again. And having said this, Madras Presidency, as the south of India was called, consisted of the 4 South Indian states. And that is the states of Chennai and Tamil Nadu, where Chennai is the capital, the city where I was born and brought up. And then there is a state of Andhra Pradesh right next to it. And then Karnataka and Kerala, which is the southern small coastal bit. So these 4 areas constituted for a very long time an area called the Madras Presidency under the British Raj. So all people down south were referred to as Madrasis, which was actually something of a culture stereotyping, and that was also not welcomed by most South Indians. But I do understand where these tropes come from. So I move on to speaking about India itself, and this is where I take my formal lecture. India has endured as a nation in which past and present entangle to produce a culture which at best is a sparkling mosaic and at worst a fractured illusion. But between these many fragments lies the truth that diversity is the accepted norm in India, woven into the very fabric of society as a unifying thread. This thread often binds all of us, but as habitually does it unravel to create multiple, frequently opposing realities. One such, what I just described, is that imperceptible boundary that exists between the north and south of India. And the field of art history subscribes to this cultural and social divide in a linear yet disjointed manner. When the idea of a modern nation was born, with independence being gained in 1947 in India, liberty was highly valued, and artistic practice too reflected the transition from a regimented hegemony to free-thinking individualism. It seemed that way. That was the ideal which was pursued. However, patriarchal constructs ensured that women were not acknowledged as inheritors of an artistic tradition. Here, I'd like to stress on the fact that Indian art and Indian women were not just the loci of cultural parameters. The paradigm of having to bear all the aspects of culture itself was solely resting after the modern era, or from the beginning of the modern era, on Indian women, it seemed. And the idea of motherhood and nationhood was so firmly intertwined together that it was not possible to distinguish one from the other. The two works that you're seeing in front of you are, one is by an artist called Abanindranath Tagore. He was the nephew of Rabindranath Tagore, whom most of us would have heard of. And the other is a print. It's a kind of a print which is used for advertising the textile mills of Ahmedabad, but it shows Mother India, Hind Devi as she was referred to, clad in a sari and making up the map of India. So both these aspects of Mother India and its association, its connotations, were something that was passed on almost like a legacy onto the women of India. So having stated this, the women artists who emerged in New India were far and few between, and often succumbed to a secondary status to that of their male counterparts. If this was a situation at a national level, in the southern region of India, which is considered to have remained fairly insulated from the rest of the nation to a large extent, the art scenario was even more markedly differentiated, with women artists largely remaining ignored and invisible within the national and even more so in the global art world. So, as usual, my question started with the age-old question of where are women artists? Why have they disappeared, or have they disappeared? Did they exist at all? These were the questions which plagued me. I did some number crunching. Most of what I'm sharing with you today comes from my exploration for my doctoral research, which began in 2007 and continues till this day. But I submitted my research in 2011 and presented my viva in 2013. Few of these notions have undergone slight changes, but largely remain, the questions still remain. So when I looked at the first place that I did this number crunching to actually answer this question for myself, is it true that women artists are underrepresented? I looked at the directories published by an autonomous organization which is regarded as the Academy of Fine Arts in India, called the Lalit Kala Academy. It was born in 1950 and it was endorsed by the government, though it was autonomous. Until 2015, it remained an autonomous organization but was taken over by the government 3 years back. This apex body actually brings out something called an artist directory, which it brought out first time in 1961, which contained the names of artists, and it contained, the first time it contained Mr. or Mrs. So that's how I was able to identify the gender. So I took to identifying the gender with the Mrs. So you'll see that changing. And they planned to bring out this directory by updating. It was mainly artists who were visible and who were registered members, so to speak, in Lalit Kala Academy. And in 1981, 20 years later, they published the second, right? And you will notice I have written in The total number of artists represented in the first one was about 500, of which there were 32 women represented. Exactly 32, right? And that's 6% of women artists to male artists who were represented in this directory, which was considered the directory of modern Indian artists at that time. 81, the numbers increased. 1,245 male, 1,075 women, 165. Not a huge difference, but yeah, marginal 13%. And then in 2006, 25 years had to elapse. Not a big difference in totals, 1,885. Males still remain 1,550 and women 331. And at this point in time, I'd also like you to look at the numbers crunched for how many North Indian women artists were there as opposed to South Indian women artists too. Though I pitched it against the number of male artists represented in the books, you'll notice that the South Indian women artist representation has in fact taken a nosedive in 1981, and then 2006 it's almost stable. So where were these artists? The first thing that startled me was to discover that were there no practicing artists in the visual arts field, and I had to stick to visual arts because though I began with the notion of including artists who were veering into artisanal practice, I found it too unwieldy and too vast. And surprisingly, though, when I looked to see whether there were artists, practicing artists, I discovered nearly 200 odd women artists over a period of 50 years, the period which is relegated as contemporary. From 1940s to 1990s, they have been practicing almost continuously, 1920s in fact. They started their practice and under no easy circumstances. These women practice in the hardest of conditions. And though I'm not speaking only of economic deprivation, I'm speaking of conditions of cultural deprivation, of societal deprivation, every kind that you will encounter, and obstacles and challenges which I think most women and other genders too would face even at this juncture as I stand here in front of you. So having proven to myself and to others, I hoped that there was a lacuna in creating a visible platform for these artists. As I discovered more and more of them, I wanted to bring to the notice of at least academia at the first instance that these visual artists, women, were actually practicing, had been practicing for a long time. The next question that was leveled, at me, and which I leveled at myself, why were these women who were practicing invisible? Is it because their work was mediocre? That was the first charge leveled against women, most women, in any discipline, not only art. So when I looked to see whether that was the case, the answer presented itself gradually, but an unequivocal no was the response that I could answer to myself. And I hope you will agree with me at the end of this lecture that their works by no means are mediocre. So this is what was my attempt. It was to renegotiate the entire attention that had been denied to these women artists and to reclaim the status of women artists of South India by a process of recovery and inclusion. The aspect of their marginalization from mainstream art and subsequent disappearance from the histories of art were investigated in terms of the overarching notion of gender embedded in social and cultural parameters. So what was the reason for this invisibility? The presentation, as I'm going through it, you'll notice that it has all the women whom I have included in just one collage at the bottom, but that doesn't mean they were visible to even the Indian art world. They weren't. Most of them were unknown entities. And these women artists were affected not just by societal constructs, but by familial, institutional systems and it was my attempt to explore the experiences of these women artists in terms of their multiple roles. Why? Because this, I hoped, would lead to an understanding of the negotiated spaces of private and public domains, which form the paradigms of art practice, visual art practice specifically, and are crucial to the expression of these women artists whom I will present now. My search has begun with an Indian artist who's very well known, and when I looked at the phases of the emergence of these women artists, I looked at the beginning of the 20th century. The 1920s, when the whole of India was undergoing a ferment of sorts, a nationalist ferment, an ideology where we were struggling to throw off the yoke of the British Raj. This was a time when women were also instated into the nationalist struggle. So this was not relegated only to the north of India, though Delhi is still the power center, political power center, New Delhi, and the long-standing motif of the Taj Mahal, which has drawn the world's attention, is one other case in point, right? So that is another stereotype that we have to live with. And women artists in South India at this point in time, what were they doing? Were they part of this nationalist movement where there was a struggle to discover or rediscover our roots, our cultural parameters? This was something that women artists too seem to have explored. And their explorations were very different from the male artists who had gained a measure of recognition. This was something that was very visible in some of their artwork. But even prior to nationalist ideologies permeating, there was a sense of conforming to these, and a sense of resilience about these women. They were not going to jump out and speak in a voice that was a collective, resistance to the British Raj or to their male comrades as we speak. But they were actually positioning themselves within these private domestic spheres in which they were already placed. And they worked within those parameters in a very conformist kind of a manner. I bring to you one of the stalwarts or the pioneers of modern Indian art. This man was almost solely responsible for bringing India into the psyche of the British Raj as a very exotic, as a very kind of accepted cultural norm. His name was Ravi Verma. I'm sure some of you would have heard of him, would have probably liked his work very much. He is a person who's been equally revered as well as demonized. The reasons exist in his own work. The two portraits that I'm showing you are not done by him. He did not do a self-portrait. This was done by his sister, who was an unknown entity. She is not referred to in any documented sources. There is one documented source, one book, which came fairly recently, and that book refers to her as the sister of Ravi Verma. And these were paintings that she did. The one on the left, my left, that you can see was a portrait that she did soon after he had died, and this is acknowledged. It was first attributed to Ravi Verma himself, and they said that he did a self-portrait, and then people realized, no, that's a portrait done by his sister, right? And this one, in the course of my research, I happened to strike up a rapport with the niece of Mangala by Tampurati. That's the name of the sister of Ravi Verma, and this niece was also named Mangala, a very popular name in that family. And so she was willing to share these paintings done by her aunt. She was also taught by her aunt for a small stint. So these were the narratives which kind of intrigued me. So here was this woman who was non-existent to the art world, but was very visible in this spot at this point in time when this man called Ravi Verma was being celebrated. He was being given awards, national recognition. He was one of the most sought after artists, and the consciousness about this person called Ravi Verma is strong till today. Even today, you will find works of art done by him gaining credence the world over. I'll just tell you why he lost that credit after a bit. But you will notice that this is a painting that he did called the Galaxy of Musicians. What was so different about this man's work was the fact that he worked at this point in time, at the end of the 19th century, he worked in oils. Oil paintings were unknown to the Indian subcontinent till Ravi Verma introduced it. He worked in oils consistently, and he worked in the style which is acceptable to the European tradition, to Western academic realists. And he worked consistently in this with Indian subject matter, the exotic appeal of Indian subject matter. So this Galaxy of Musicians, in fact, was a long-standing reminder of his skill in the academic realistic method, or in the technique that he used with the medium of oil on canvas. He was actually credited to have also, is credited with having also started a printing press. He started one in order to popularize his images as well as his, his content, and that's what he did. And he started with this printing press, and this became too big for him. Eventually, he had to sell off the printing press. But the paintings that were translated to print, even today, these iconic images take their place in the altars of Hindu homes across South India. So you'll find the Lakshmi image, and you'll find the Saraswati that he created, which were translated into prints. They became hugely popular. Every single house, even now, will have these images. Will have one print at least, or at least a reference to it in some way. And they are worshipped at home. And if you, incidentally, Ravi Verma is credited with also another aspect. He's supposed to have invented the way the Indian sari is draped today. You will notice that the Indian sari was never draped in the same way throughout the north and the south of India. It was draped differently, and India, as I said, being the mosaic that it is, within a few minutes, if you are standing on the borders of one state to the other, it's like you're visiting a new country. You can move from Tamil Nadu to Andhra Pradesh. You'll speak a different language there. You have to. And you have to wear different drapes. The way of draping the sari is different according to the need of the woman. And you will also notice the jewelry, the manner of speaking, everything changes. Within a few minutes that can happen. Not necessary to travel the world to see the world, really. It's a kind of microcosm there. And this man seemed to have popularized this way of draping the sari, what I'm dressed in even now as I speak. And this happened in the 1900s. So till then, women were dressing differently. Today, most young women don't know how to drape a sari at all, because they have taken to wearing these easier stitched garments of pants or pantaloons, or the salwar kameez as it is popularly called, which is worn in the north of India. So this has come to stay. So the stitched garment was not known to India in the 1900s. There was no stitching. My grandmother would in fact have she would not have to wear a blouse. She never wore a blouse. She only draped the sari like a pan and then wove it around her body, right? And they didn't have scissors. They would cut on a ready-made board if they wanted to cut cloth, and cutting cloth was regarded as sacrilege because the woven cloth was hand-woven, so it was regarded as sacred. So to drape it completely, like it happened in all ancient cultures, around your body was an act of sacredness. So this was also usurped, and Ravi Verma seemed to have understood this populist imagery. He became a huge hit, and he was from the royal family, so all parameters were carried on with this icon called Ravi Verma, who was created. Even now, his paintings speak volumes, or the popularity of his paintings speak volumes. This was a silk sari which got into the Guinness Book of World Records in 2008 for being the world's most expensive sari. And you'll notice that the galaxy of musicians is represented prominently on the front part of the sari itself. So that's how long-standing Ravi Verma has been. There are books written about him, exploring his prolific work, and here is this woman who was in his household, who never got the chance of even being recognized as an artist at all. Her name was Mangala by Thampurati. She lived for 84, almost 90 years, and she painted till she was in her late 80s, maybe even to the last day. When I spoke to her niece, Mangala, she said that her grand aunt would every day get up at 4 a.m., light the oil lamp. And Kerala is known to be a matrilineal society, so women inherit the property. But unfortunately, it's only in name. They cannot sell the property, they do not have any economic viability. So in their matrilineal homes, they could continue to live. So she did. She lived in Kilimanur for a long time, even after her marriage. She could live in Kilimanur, which was her ancestral property, and she would light the lamp, say her prayers at 80 years of age, and she would go do her morning chores and then get down to the studio. She had her own studio space in the 1900s when she was painting, even for commissions, for portrait commissions. She was so good at skilled at this new form of art which had emerged. And these are some of the things that you would notice about her. She was obviously a matronly figure, and as I said, she worked within this conformist mode, within the family, the domestic sphere. It's not that her narrative was an easy one. Just because she was born into an elite royal family, so-called royal family, it wasn't easy. She was allowed to practice her art along with her brothers, but was never allowed to practice beyond being an amateur painter. She was not allowed to become a professional painter. She was never allowed to travel. She was, of course, married off very young, and she was allowed to, when she had the time, she could paint, but taking care of the household. Even when there was a huge tragedy which struck her, she lost a daughter who was 32 years old, and she took care of the grandchildren. She took in the grandchildren and took care of them. But even at that juncture, she never gave up her art. She continued to paint in small, intermittent, portions, and continued to work for herself, it seems, to get over the grief of losing her daughter. So these are narratives that you never hear about. How do women handle this burden of family? It's expected of them, right? And this is how she handled it as best as she could, but despite giving and giving to the family itself. That's the Mangala whom I met, who was as a babe in her arms, right? And this is just a case in point to show you how differently a woman artist can think from a male artist, even her own brother. So this is a painting done with two paintings done by two different artists. One obviously by Ravi Verma, no points for guessing which one, and the other by Mangala by Thampurati. I've already said that there, and you will notice how differently they perceive the same idea of alms giving. Now, one is an act of donation, where you know that the donor is superior and the other person is inferior. And you will also notice a hierarchic connotation in the costumes, in the background, in the way it invites the gaze of the viewer. So Ravi Verma's painting is obviously all of this. And you will notice that the woman is clad in the saris. The draping of the sari again comes into focus here. She's draped in an upper caste sari mode, right? And that is the Brahmin class. You've heard of the caste system enough in terms of India, I'm sure. It does persist even now to in a very subtle manner. But in Ravi Verma's case, he was presenting it as the exotic. And you will notice the manner in which she throws the coins into the hands of the young male beggar who is seated into his waiting hands. She throws it almost haughtily. That is my reading anyways. And this work is where my interest came in. It was probably done a little later, because Ravi Verma passed away in 1906, but this was done in 1899, the almsgiving that he did. She did this completely, presumably on her own. Again, it was attributed to Ravi Verma for a very long time. Her work, Mangala Bai's work, was attributed to Ravi Verma because it was so good. But it was very different in its approach. So again, it was revisited and it was found to be Mangala Bai's work. And she didn't sign initially. Then later on, she took to signing her commissioned works towards the end of her life. You will notice that the whole equation has changed in her work. There is an old beggar woman, semi-nude. Like I said, the women in those days, young and old, did not wear a blouse. Hot climate, very comfortable, I'm sure. And you will notice that the young woman who's with the cascading tresses is probably from the household, royal household as such, or at least an affluent one. But she's dressed in the Kerala garment, which is just a white cloth which is tied around the waist, and a blouse. The blouse made its appearance. And this is also a point to notice, because there is this divide in terms of the giving here. And she's not giving, this is an act of giving. She's not giving coins, but she's bringing out gruel for the beggar woman who has come at the threshold. So this difference is also highlighted by the fact that this is a gendered space that we are looking at. Ravi Verma existed in the public space, in the psyche of the public sphere. And here, Mangala Bai was in the domestic space, in a private space. This is one of the, I'm sure gender historians will always speak of this divide between the public and the private spaces, how it's being used as a tool of oppression in many ways. And this is something that seems to be reiterated in the two works that I'm showing you. And this work that you see ahead, this was the one she did, which she has signed, and it hangs in a college, a women's college, Government Women's College in Trivandrum. That was her in her 80s, working with her palette and an easel, which was a huge discovery in that sense. And this painting of Mahatma Gandhi is quite large, which was unheard of at that time. Large-scale painting was not done, and women, of course, never painted for commissions. She did all of this, and she still remains undocumented. This is the first time, or rather the second time, but internationally the first time that I'm bringing out these sources at all. This has never been published. The photographs, some of these photographs, this one photograph appeared in one book in 2015, I think, but otherwise nothing, no record of her having existed. And she did paint quite a few paintings. Now, after having done the Mangala Bai thrust, I'm moving into another area of the four South Indian states. I'm moving into the art of Andhra Pradesh, and it is to the nationalist times of the 1920s and 30s. At this time, there was a renaissance happening in Bengal, in the Abanindranath Tagore's household. The Tagore household was bringing about a Bengali renaissance where they were denying the existence of Ravi Verma's painting style. They did not want Western or European painting influences. They took to a school of students under Abanindranath, took to working in something called the Bengal style, where they took inspiration or drew inspiration from Mughal miniatures. I'm sure you've heard of Mughal paintings and of paintings from the Rajput times. So they went back to their cultural roots, denying the existence of Ravi Verma. So now you know why and where this vilification of Ravi Verma's prints and his paintings began. So with nationalism gaining a strong foothold, women also participated in this visual exploration, and there was an artist in Andhra Pradesh called Mela Rama Rao. I've mentioned him there. He went to Bengal, to West Bengal at that time, to Kolkata, and he apparently met the Tagores, and he was greatly influenced by this style of painting. So this very romantic Mughal Rajput miniature style of painting was something that he apparently enjoyed. And who was his muse? His artist wife, Satyavani. Unfortunately, he died by the time he was in his 20s, and this widow continued his work, but she was a mere copy artist. I'm sure many of you have admired copied works of Ravi Verma's, which are passed off sometimes as the original, but most of them are reproductions, obviously. That was a given practice. Women were allowed to copy, you see. So that meant that they need not think. The composition was already well done and dusted, and of course the inspiration comes from another source. So here was Satyavani. She was actually looking at a very different kind of a subject content. It's the birth of Buddha. You see that even the subject matter of these women artists is very different from the ones that male members would usually choose. So when they chose, what they chose to copy also seems to have a certain relevance. So she chose to copy that, and here she is depicted by her husband when she was pregnant, and she holds her baby in her arms. She painted for a very long time, even after his death, but only as a hobby painter. She was never regarded as a painter in her own right. And there was another woman who was also within that same Andhra group as I speak of it. The Mela Rama Rao actually started a school, a style, which was called the Andhra school or style. His sister, whose name was Krishna Ma, was also a painter who did the same kind of intervention. But she went a step forward. She did not do just copy work. She also moved into making her own compositions, which I'll just show you in a minute. And her subjects became, moved away from this romantic depiction. The exotic depiction is when she was in her copying phase. But between 1920 and 25, she seems to have moved into her own, and she's become a nationalist artist. She did this work called Noolutiyatu. Those of you who know Telugu, that's a language spoken in Andhra Pradesh, like I said, a few minutes away from one state to the other, you will speak a different language. Noolutiyatu in Telugu actually means to spin the yarn. And this was a motive that was used by Mahatma Gandhi to promote nationalism, economic nationalism, to make your own cloth, to weave, to spin your own yarn, cotton yarn, and to make it. And that resulted in the Khadi movement and the Swadeshi movement. Khadi is a cotton cloth which is woven, hand-woven cotton cloth. And this, many art historians now think of these nationalist art motives as being very, very useful and prominent, because these were used in propaganda material. They were used in posters in the Bengal school, for example. So her take on this is nevertheless within this domestic sphere that I have been discussing so far. You'll notice that the woman is a nationalist, whoever that is. It personifies all women who are nationalists. She is spinning a yarn, but in the privacy of her home. And how do you know that? You have a baby who's playing behind her. So she's not given up the domesticity that was, thrust upon her. She was probably, she doesn't give away her commitments in order to take on the role of the nationalist and to struggle for her freedom as a nation, as a part of the nation. So this was a very intriguing example, but a one-off example. It wasn't something that was pursued ardently by others, and Krishna Ma herself gave up art as soon as she was widowed. She was a nationalist wife herself who was part of the freedom struggle. He died in his 20s again, and as a widow, she gave up her art almost completely and went on to become a social service person. She thought that that was a better sphere to be in to reach more people, it appears. And she probably did not get the interactions, the encouragement to work in the art field there, because it became almost non-existent for a bit. Then I move into another area, to Madras, where I come from. Madras was a very peculiar kind of a space. It's an urban space, it's a port city. So people seem to have come from all over the world. In fact, it was the first English settlement in India. And it was from here that the East India Company kind of established itself. But it was always a transition city in that sense of the word. And it still carries that stamp. And in this transition city, it's the capital city of Tamil Nadu, so it attracted a lot of, and it was called Madras. Even when the whole of Madras province, the whole 4 South Indian states were called Madras, the city was also called Madras. And it became Chennai fairly recently in 1996 because of political interventions. And it also has another association with art. It was the first government college for fine arts was established in Chennai, in Madras, but not as a government college for fine arts, but as a school for industrial arts under the British in 1850s. And it was mainly to make products to export to Britain. Products made industrially, mass-produced by artisans, male artisans. No women were admitted when it was an industrial school. And then it slowly, gradually shifted over to becoming a fine art college or institute. And it became the Government College of Fine Arts after a long history where many students enrolled, and there was, and under different Indian principles or presidents as we would call it. One of the presidents who came from Bengal, who was greatly influential, was a man called D.P. Roy Chowdhury. And after him was this young man at that time called K.C.S. Panikkar. Now K.C.S. Panikkar was a legend, became a legend for modern Indian art in the south of India, in Madras. He is credited to have started something called the Madras movement, a name that I don't think he would have given it, he did suggest it himself. He's also a person who is so well known because he started an artist commune called the Cholamandal Artist Village, which is still there in Chennai. It's on the beachfront and it's hugely popular, but not in the sense that we would understand it. It was the first artist commune in the country and where artists worked together, and K.C.S. Panikkar was such a visionary that he actually, for some time, the nationalist urge had thrown away all that was European. But when he came into the picture in the 1940s, in the 1930s and 40s as a principal, he encouraged the entire, the art world to look to European influences, but bring in regional influences of Tamil Nadu, of Kerala, of Andhra, wherever the art students came in from. He asked them to use the local, the local flavors as a source of inspiration. So he was a huge influence. And one of his students, or one of these students in the College of Fine Arts, is the woman you see next to him. So I've been speaking so much about K.C.S. Panikkar. That woman was a student alongside, just soon after him. He was already a lecturer in the college, and he married her, and she gave up art completely. She was a good artist, and they had a couple of children. The son became a sculptor too, but refused to take Panikkar's name as his, because of various reasons, one being that he did not want to be under his father's shadow. But this woman chose to give up her artistic practice almost completely after her student days, and she took to embroidering and textiles and only relegated herself to the family. And she is supposed to have lived in Cholamandal for the rest of her years. She did for the community. She helped him in bringing out his career path, and had no regrets apparently. From my conversations with the family, she is supposed to have quoted saying that in order to gain a space, that is a family space, I had to give up a space. That was a kind of negotiation that the women were doing, even when they were seeking art as an education, as a career path. So she moved into this space consciously, it seems. Now, another artist who did the same, who came from Kerala, her name was Kamala Podwal, before she married an Indian artist called Pradosh Das Gupta. I'm sure many of you have heard of Pradosh Das Gupta if you're in any way interested in art. He's a Kolkata-based artist who started a group called the Kolkata Group and became really, again, like you heard the likes of Raza, M.F. Hussain. They were all, at the same time in that moment of ferment, they were starting different kinds of movements in their regional practices, art practices. She again gave up her art practice in order to be the partner and the wife, solely the wife. And she said her works, she in fact won a national award. She was given a Lifetime Achievement Award for sculpting by the Rabindra Bharati University in Shantiniketan when she was much older. But her works are featured nowhere. Her works that I am showing you today are in her family home, in her matrilineal home in Kerala. And none of them have been featured in books speaking about South Indian women artists at all. So she also uses a subject matter of mother and child. That seems to be a preoccupation. Though I'm not focusing on the subject, in the visuals you are able to sense that connecting thread of how they seem to come back to this idea of motherhood, which seems to be a sensibility. She lost a child at this stage apparently, and that was an anguish that is reflected, but in a very gentle manner. That's a work, not that she was incapable of powerful works, that's a sculpture done by her. And again, to bring to your notice that these women were not stuck with age-old traditional formats or compositions. They experimented, even within whatever little art practice they had indulged in, they experimented, but gave it up so readily, it seems. At least it appears that way again. From this 1960s to 70s, you see a sea change. Women have come into they have been influenced by Europe, by Western art, so they have seen Expressionism, Impressionism, they've seen every kind of art form which was breaking all barriers. No realistic, the idea of abstraction had come to stay. But KCS Panikkar, the principal, was giving the clarion call in the Government College of Fine Arts in Chennai to bring local, regional idioms into play. And so some of the women students did respond to it. I'd like to only show the visuals and just speak about it in a few minutes because I think I'm way over time. This woman called Rani Poovaya comes from the state of Karnataka, but she moved to Chennai to study under, not first in the Government College of Fine Arts. She in fact studied in the college that I am currently teaching in Stella Maris College in Chennai. We do have a fine arts program and art history is a strength. And here she learnt for 3 years the BA in Fine Arts, or what was called a pre-university course at that time. And then she moved into the Government College of Fine Arts where she studied and then taught. Her narrative and the narrative of 3 others whom I will just share with you is quite tragic. Two others at least. She moved to the United States with her husband when she got married, and she was involved in a car accident in 1982. The work that you're seeing in front of you was done in the interim period. And when she was in the car accident, she was wanting to come back to India. In fact, that year they planned to come back to India. Her travels had taken her through Tehran, from India to the US and back and forth. And finally, when she was seeking her roots again, she was involved in this accident and she went into a coma for 10 years before she passed away in 1992, leaving behind a young daughter and a son. And this is thanks to them that I'm showing you her work at all. That's her daughter who contributed to showing her work. Her work at that juncture when she did it was influenced by Europe. You can see the abstraction, the rhythm of it. But at the same time, you'll also notice a kind of a white line which pervades. I did happen to share with some of you. Her interest was in recreating a regional traditional craft form or woman's art form called the kolam. A kolam is something that is done with rice powder, dry or wet, and it's done on the threshold of homes. Whether you're it can be a simple hut. She's supposed to have visited the fisherwomen's hut where she saw these beautiful columns of rice powder. It's a craft tradition. I can't call it a craft tradition. It is an artistic practice for the women alone. Only women practice it. At dawn or before daybreak, they are expected to draw these rice flour patterns, which are premeditated, and they work it out as almost like a donation to the ants which will come seeking food, apparently. And that kolam seems to have inspired her, and she did a number of works in which it is integrated as these white lines which permeate her work. Another artist who tragically died at the age of 29 while giving birth to her child, which also died, and her works drew accolades when she was a student at the College of Fine Arts itself. You will notice that she has also brought in family, but in a very different manner from what I just showed you. She's brought in an expressionist, an emotional content into her work. It's almost like if you've heard of Gauguin's work, his cloisonne enamel technique is what comes to mind when you look at her work. Her work is regarded as highly symbolic. Notice again the Kerala background. That is where she comes from, a tiny remote village. She struggled to get out of the village into the Government College of Fine Arts, and there she made it for the time that she was a student, and then as an art practitioner she was just coming into her own, had her first solo exhibition when she died in 1969. The other artist, the only one who escaped death from this slot, was this woman called Mela Jacob, because she gave up art for 20 years. She did not do any sculpture because she went on travels with her husband, but she speaks of, when I met her, she speaks of being the first woman to have gotten the national award. In 1962, she said she won the national award for sculpture. She was the first woman to have received it, and from the Lalit Kala Academy that I mentioned earlier. And that is her old work, which says maternity, and you'll notice the abstract form has kept her on her toes, but not the way she approaches the form itself. Again, that sensibility is something that seems to come from their experiences, the women artists' experiences, rather than anything else. Another artist, again tragic. I don't mean to stress on that tragedy because that kind of memorializes them, but the fact that their life and their work was interrupted is something that has to be noticed. So this woman was a Parsi woman who married a South Indian artist who worked in the Government College of Fine Arts, both of them were students in the Government College of Fine Arts, and they established themselves as artists in the Cholamandal artist village, the artist commune that was started by Panikkar. Their best years of artistic activity and production were in the artist commune. The artist commune itself made sure that these artists could live off their own artwork. They produced goods. You see the jewelry piece that she's wearing? They made such jewelry pieces and sold them. So what Panikkar was trying to do was to create a self-sufficient commune where the artists need not go outside for work, that they would feed their art practice through the sale of different art products that they made. So she was extremely involved with that, it appears, and when she died because of cancer, she had started to work with she had this very naive, almost childlike way of working, and you see that very popular god which is represented. There's an exhibition going on here in the university, The Universe Looks Down. I don't know if you all have seen it. It's there in the Bailey Library. And there is a depiction of this monkey god, Hanuman. And that was her series which she did on the Ramayana. She was extremely, skillful, no doubt, but again, life interrupted. I end this with just showing you two artists who continue to practice. One, an art teacher from Andhra Pradesh in Hyderabad. She worked for 3 decades in the Jawaharlal Nehru Technical University, right? And she taught fine arts, and she worked with colored pencil on paper. Her works showcase these women, hard-working, ordinary women from the lower echelons of the Andhra society. These women with their huge burnt bodies were the ones whom she saw every day, and whom she knew as the milkmaid, as a person who was, working on the roads, laying the roads, and that's what she depicted in her color pencil works. These are mediums which are not chosen by male artists. They will never be chosen by them because it is not the given thing to do. The other artist comes from the Ravi Verma lineage. She's a princess. She carries forward the princess title, but that didn't give her any leeway. She was not allowed to paint. She painted in the dead of the night. She is now an 80-year-old who continues to paint large scale, but never again acknowledged. And she works in that super realist field. And for her, she calls it, she used the term sarva, she speaks about the alankaram, or the beauty of the jewelry that her visions were. She says she envisions these ancient people, and she's interested in the jewelry that lies, the golden jewelry which lies against the skin. Unabashedly, she works with these women's bodies and male bodies as well. Though I showcase this, her works are very powerful too. No recognition as such. As an artist. The last bit, 1980s onwards, women started to become more individualistic in their expression. All the women artists that I'm going to show you thus onwards don't work only in the South Indian states. They're not stuck in any manner of speaking. They explore. Some of them continue to be within a domestic sphere. Others have explored artistically speaking, and they've also moved out of their comfort zones, geographically locating themselves elsewhere too. For example, the artworks that you see of Anjani Reddy, she is in Hyderabad. She was again a teacher who took to art practice, won a measure of recognition, national recognition, but not international. And she works, even today, she works with these young women who surround her, the college-going young women, who are her students and her muses. And there's the other artist, Asma Menon, who is from Chennai. No roots in that sense of the word. She has been working in Chennai for a very long time. The artist whom I will end with, on a video with, Pushpa Mala, she does extremely variegated work. She works with something called photo installations. She calls it her scripted photo novellas. I will show you one. And she works with, that's an image of herself posing as a Ravi Verma painting. She does these tableaus, and she works in collaborations where she does these photographic installations, or photo romances as she calls them sometimes. It's a very tongue-in-cheek kind of a spoof that she creates with these photo novellas. And Rati Devi from Kerala, unknown, unheard of, but very, very strong statements, as you can notice from her artwork itself. An artist who, one of the few contemporary Indian women artists who gained international repute, Sheila Thurber. I'm not going to be able to speak about her at length, but suffice it to say she's found international renown, though she keeps to very strong emotive subjects, Indian rooted. She works on an international agenda, I would suggest, because her works are huge installations which are housed in places as famous as the Tate Gallery, Tate Modern in London, everywhere. She's the only woman artist who is featured, a contemporary woman artist who's featured in a recent article, 2018, of top Indian modern Indian artists. The only other woman who was featured is long gone Amrita Shergill. Out of the 10 top modern Indian artists, it's Sheila Gowda and Amrita Shergill, two women who find a place. 20% is not so bad, isn't it? And there is Vasudha Thurur. So an artist whom I have personally, I lived with her for a bit, in the sense that she put me up when I went to visit her in Baroda. Though she was based in Chennai for a very long time, she moved to Baroda in Gujarat, which was, it's a focus of attention because currently it is a political hotbed. Gujarat and the riots were something that she actually personally went through. And you'll notice some of that anxiety reflected in her work. So, coming to what the young women artists are doing. First of all, they hated to be called young. They liked young, I suppose, some of them. They hated to be called women artists. They did not want the prefix women artists. Most of the women artists don't want that because it's again a kind of pigeonholing which is happening. The other aspect of it that was very different with this younger crop of artists who were coming out was they were extremely experimental. There was no stopping their experimentation because they were anyway not going to be represented anywhere. That's what one of the artists told me. For example, this young artist called Archana Hande, who works now in Bombay, all over India really. She's currently in the northeast of India teaching students, helping them to prepare for the student Binale, which will happen as part of the Kochi Binale. Have you heard of the Kochi Binale, which has been happening for a few years now? Her work she created this website called arrangeyourOwnmarriage.com, where you can actually go and pick out body parts to arrange your own marriage to your dream man or woman. So you see these buttocks, she actually created them, and she had faces like the Barbie doll or the Ken, and you can click on your website because arranged marriage is the way we go in India. We have arranged marriages still where we meet the person and get married to them. The only thing, background checks that are done are in terms of the family of the boy and the girl. So this was her kind of take on the arranged marriage aspect and the marketing of the young men and women's bodies and their body parts as such. And that's Benita, an artist who's been working in Chennai. She crafts her work very carefully with rice paper and with eco-friendly material, experiments with that. That's another artist who's completely dropped off the radar. She works, I think she's in a period of gestation currently. She works with painting, with photographic installation. Some of you may recognize that symbol that is around the woman's neck. It's a modern woman wearing a traditional symbol of marriage. Only the woman wears a symbol in India, mind you. No rings are exchanged. These tiny little symbols with the icon, you'll notice that on her neck, around her neck, that carries an icon which states that she is a married woman. Only she bears it. And other symbolic experiments include, this is an artist who works with a very different medium called, she works in a very surreal, fantasy manner. She works with etchings, printmaker, and there's another photo installator who works with the idea of hair, the woman's pride. In India, we have these fetishes. We love fair skin. The maximum number of advertisements are for the hair and the fair skin. So we have a product called Fair and Lovely, which Archana Hande also explored in her website, the one that I showed you. And here, Nandini Valli Muthaya, an Chennai-based artist, she explores the idea of hair being a caste statement, where an upper-class woman, that's herself, posed as the tied-up bun and the blouse showing off the body and the sari drape, and that's a lower-class woman, right? And her way of draping the sari, from just the backs and the hairdo, you could understand the anxieties, the tension that prevails in terms of motives which are generally, cultural motives which are generally accepted as a woman's role. That's an artist who was a colleague for a bit, Rajni Krishnan. She works with art povera, materials which are poor materials, terracotta, and she creates these images, abstracted images, which still speak of motherhood. Other artists who have been very experimental, using their own bodies to cast the impression. This artist actually lies down on the canvas and draws herself out, and that the one in the center, Shantamani, actually body casts herself in plaster of Paris, and this one she recreated the body cast using charcoal bits and speaks of it as a frozen phoenix and home. So you will very well be able to gauge the level to which these women have pushed the boundaries of gender representations through their art forms. And the final work that I'm sharing with you is by an Andhra-based artist. She belongs to the most backward, untouchable community. All women are considered lower by birth in the Hindu echelons, and there are people who exist beyond even that lower stratification called untouchables. So for the untouchables, or the Dalits as they are referred to today, to make a presence politically was a little more feasible than in any other field. There are political motivations for women to come up from these quarters, but not in other fields, which is a choice made by the self. So a woman artist like Shanti Swarupini works with identity a great deal, and how she clothes, and she actually titles it Clothing the Identity. And that's where I conclude, where I think though Indian art and visual arts have been explored by these women artists so differently, it doesn't stop there, because they are not represented in any exhibitions, in gallery spaces, in national forums. They're not given too much of a visibility. Nobody documents their work in that sense of the word. There's no, I'm not saying that they should be eulogized for being women artists. That was never the case. They don't want that either. But at the same time, there does need to be a socially conscious effort to bring about an awareness of the works of some of these artists, at least, in order for us to be able to understand where they are coming from, what is their location, and to go back to my first question, where are the women artists, artisans? If this is the case for people from different stratas working with visual art, can you imagine the status quo of women craftspersons? Their work, their location is just kind of annihilated. So that is the conclusion that I sought. And so thank you very much. I'm going to show you a video.